Imagine a country where the price of steak changes while you're eating it. You walk into a supermarket in Buenos Aires, you grab a package of meat marked 500 pesos. By the time you reach the checkout line, 7 minutes later, a clerk has peeled off the sticker and slapped on a new one, 600 pesos. You rush to pay, heart pounding, because you know that if the line is too long, your monthly salary might lose another 5% of its value before you reach the register. This wasn't dystopian fiction. This was Tuesday in Argentina, December 2023. Annual inflation, 211%. Monthly inflation, 25.5%. The peso was melting so fast that prices doubled every 3 months. The central bank was printing money to finance government deficits. The official exchange rate was a fairy tale. The real price of dollars traded at a 50% premium on the black market they called the blue dollar. Foreign reserves had evaporated. The poverty rate stood at 41.7%, nearly 20 million people, and the government was running a deficit of 4.6% of GDP, a deficit it had run in 113 of the prior 123 years. Then came the man with the chainsaw, Javier Milei, wild hair, TV pundit background, anarcho-capitalist economist who literally waved a chainsaw at rallies to symbolize his plan: slash the state to the bone. Not reform it, not trim it, delete it. On day one, Milei devalued the currency by 50%. He froze public works. He told the provinces, there is no money. The goal? Turn a massive fiscal deficit into a surplus overnight. The crazy part? He actually did it. For the first time in over a decade, the Argentine government spent less than it earned. The markets rallied, bonds soared. The IMF gave a standing ovation. But here's the catch. While Wall Street celebrated, Main Street froze, consumption collapsed, poverty spiked to 52.9%, more than half the country. Real wages fell 25 to 35%. It's economic surgery without anesthesia. The question we're answering today is simple. Can you starve a fever without killing the patient? We're breaking down the mechanics of the blender strategy used to liquidate debt, the reality of dollarization promises versus currency controls, and whether this radical austerity is the cure for a century of decline or the spark for a social explosion. Hit that subscribe button, because what happens in Argentina doesn't stay in Argentina. This is the laboratory for what happens when a country stops printing money and starts facing the hangover. Let's go. To understand the chainsaw, you first need to understand the rot. Argentina wasn't always a case study in dysfunction. In the early 20th century, it was one of the world's wealthiest countries, a destination for European immigrants comparable to the United States in per capita income. Buenos Aires was the Paris of South America. Then came the decline. 3 successive waves of borrowing and collapse since the 1970s. Same pattern, every time. Initial optimism, capital inflows driven by commodity booms, unsustainable deficits, sudden capital flight, currency devaluation, inflation acceleration, default, restructuring, repeat. This wasn't just economic distress. This was institutional damage. Repeated policy reversals destroyed confidence in Argentine institutions, the independence of the central bank, the credibility of peso-denominated assets. By 2023, Argentina had defaulted so often it had become a national tradition. December 2023, inflation at 211%. The fiscal deficit at 4.6% of GDP, the central bank printing pesos to cover government spending, fueling the inflation spiral. A complex system of multiple exchange rates. The official rate kept artificially low through intervention, the blue dollar black market reflecting true scarcity, trading at a 50% premium. Residents couldn't freely convert pesos to dollars. Real economic activity had contracted. Poverty at 41.7%, unemployment rising, labour market informality at 40% of the workforce. The government's capacity to address this through traditional policy was exhausted. Fiscal deficit unsustainable. Central bank reserves evaporated. Access to international capital markets foreclosed by repeated defaults. The country had borrowed, defaulted, restructured, and repeated the cycle so many times that creditors had simply stopped lending. This was the burning building Milei walked into, and his diagnosis: the building should never have been built in the first place. Milei's intellectual foundation came from Austrian school economics and libertarian philosophy. But his approach to the Argentine crisis wasn't technical, it was ideological. He viewed the problem not as a macroeconomic imbalance amenable to gradual adjustment, but as fundamental institutional rot. The central bank had become a tool for fiscal financing. Government expenditure had expanded far beyond productive levels. Regulatory restrictions prevented markets from clearing, creating chronic shortages and black markets. The prescription followed logically: achieve a balanced budget through dramatic spending reductions. Halt central bank monetary expansion to end inflation financing. Deregulate economic activity to allow prices to adjust. At inauguration, Milei announced zero deficit as a state policy. Not a target, not a goal, a mandate. This was extraordinarily ambitious. Argentina had run fiscal deficits in 113 of the preceding 123 years. A balanced budget was historically rare, yet the Milei administration achieved it with remarkable speed. From a 4.6% deficit in 2023 to a primary fiscal surplus of 0.3% of GDP in 2024, the first full-year surplus since 2006. By 2025, the surplus reached 1.4% of GDP. These weren't cyclical improvements from revenue growth during recovery. This was structural fiscal adjustment through sustained spending restraint. The mechanism, what opponents called la licuadora, the blender. Here's how it worked. Rather than negotiating new budget allocations through Congress, the administration deployed executive decrees to freeze nominal spending in most categories, while allowing prices of government services to adjust to market levels. Energy, water, transportation, public university services, prices surged. Between December 2023 and March 2024, the price level nearly doubled. The devaluation, the liberalization of controlled prices, the sharp monetary contraction all hit at once. Nominal government expenditure, held constant at prior levels, now represented dramatically lower real spending. Let me show you the breakdown. Pensions bore 38% of the initial spending reduction. Nominal pension payments frozen or increased modestly while inflation eroded purchasing power. The average pension fell 25% in real terms. Teachers, public sector employees, government contractors all experienced nominal freezes or below inflation increases. Real income declines of 25 to 35%. Simultaneously, the government suspended public infrastructure investment, froze capital expenditures, deferred payments to provincial governments. In some cases, suspended obligations entirely or paid through peso-denominated bonds of uncertain value. The math worked. The deficit disappeared. But the social consequences became increasingly visible as 2024 progressed. Universities saw budgets reduced by 30% in real terms. Professors' salaries fell by similar magnitudes. Maintenance deferred. Research funding evaporated. Teachers received frozen salaries while inflation raged, precipitating widespread strikes throughout 2024 and 2025. Retirees, many living on pensions barely above poverty lines, found their incomes further compressed. Organised protests, street blockades. In March 2025, violent police repression resulting in injuries to protesters, including a photographer struck in the head by a tear gas canister. Healthcare provision deteriorated. Hospitals faced budget constraints. Pharmaceutical coverage restricted. Medical research curtailed. This was the distributional reality. Wealthy Argentines who could afford private education, private healthcare, private transportation, less affected. Those dependent on public provision, crushed under the weight of the adjustment. Think about the irony of that. A libertarian president, elected to dismantle state power, using state power to force the poorest to bear the cost of stabilization. Complementing fiscal consolidation, the administration implemented a three-phase monetary strategy designed to establish credibility, reduce inflation through currency appreciation, and gradually transition toward market-determined exchange rates. Phase 1 began December 2023 with a brutal 50% devaluation. Official rate from 400 pesos per dollar to 800 pesos per dollar. This eliminated much of the currency overvaluation that had accumulated, made Argentine exports more competitive, and simultaneously raised domestic peso prices of imported essentials, fuel, food, everything. Then came the crawling peg. The exchange rate would depreciate at a predetermined 2% per month. The rationale? In a highly dollarized economy where residents price transactions in dollars and hold dollar liabilities, the exchange rate functions as the crucial anchor for inflation expectations. By committing to a predetermined devaluation rate lower than ongoing inflation, the administration sought to create real currency appreciation, the peso gaining value in real terms despite nominal depreciation, thereby reducing inflation toward the pace of currency devaluation. The government pursued this through import compression, recession-driven contraction in domestic demand, recovery in agricultural exports following drought relief, and reduction of government spending on imported goods. In June 2024, Phase 2 introduced a freeze on the broad money supply. By freezing broad money in nominal terms, the government signalled no further monetary expansion, anchoring inflation expectations. But here's where the trap closed. The continued 2% monthly crawling peg, combined with inflation rates exceeding the pace of depreciation, generated real exchange rate appreciation. The peso strengthened in real terms. By February 2024, the central bank halved the crawl from 2% to 1% per month. This created a fundamental tension. The exchange rate peg and monetary freeze served as anchors for inflation expectations, reducing inflation rapidly. But that reduction generated real peso appreciation that undermined export competitiveness and created incentives for capital flight as investors anticipated eventual devaluation. You see the bind. The very policies that stabilized inflation made the currency unsustainably strong. These tensions forced Phase 3 in April 2024. Transition from crawling peg to a dirty float, a managed floating exchange rate system. The official rate would fluctuate within a band, 1,000 pesos per dollar at the floor, 1,400 at the ceiling. The band itself would expand monthly by 1% at both limits. The central bank would intervene within this band. Buy dollars when the peso appreciated toward the floor, injecting pesos to prevent excess strength. Sell dollars when the peso depreciated toward the ceiling, absorbing pesos to prevent weakness. Crucially, interventions would not be sterilized. When the central bank purchased dollars, peso supply increased. When it sold dollars, peso supply contracted. The non-sterilized approach tied exchange rate policy to monetary policy automatically. By late 2024 and into 2025, however, the peso came under renewed pressure. Investor confidence declined following corruption allegations against the president's sister, political complications from September 2025, Buenos Aires elections where opposition Peronists outperformed Milei's party, concerns about sustainability of the fiscal adjustment. The peso depreciated toward the upper band limit of 400, where it remained. The government conducted substantial interventions to prevent further depreciation, drawing down central bank reserves, purchasing dollar-denominated assets in secondary markets. These interventions represented reversion toward active exchange rate management, despite theoretical commitment to floating rates. The dirty float was dirty indeed. Let me be clear about something. The Milei administration achieved undeniable and substantial inflation reduction. Monthly consumer price inflation, 25.5% in December 2023, down to 1.9% by mid-2024, reaching lows of 1.5% by May 2025. The lowest monthly inflation rates in several years. Year-over-year inflation, 201.4% at end of 2023, down to 43.5% by mid-2025. A reduction of 168 percentage points in 18 months. Wholesale prices even registered deflation. A 0.3% decline in May 2025, the first decline in wholesale prices in 17 years. These achievements were genuine, substantial progress in addressing one of the world's most severe inflation crises. But here's what they don't tell you. Understanding the mechanisms underlying this reduction requires distinguishing between temporary and durable factors. The inflation reduction through March 2024 operated largely through a one-time price level shock. Exchange rate adjustment and price liberalization allowed previously suppressed prices to adjust upward while base effects wore off. Subsequent inflation reduction operated through different mechanisms. Real appreciation of the peso reduced inflation of tradable goods. Contraction in aggregate demand from recession reduced inflation of non-tradables. Nominal freezing of wage growth from labour market slack and government policy reduced cost pressures. Private sector wage growth lagged inflation by substantial margins throughout 2024 and 2025. Nominal wage increases restricted by high unemployment. real wage declines of 25 to 35% over the period. Think about what this means. These real wage reductions operated as a powerful disinflation mechanism. Reduced purchasing power, limited demand for goods and services, reducing pressure on prices. The question, are these mechanisms permanent or vulnerable to reversal? By late 2024 and 2025, inflation again accelerated modestly from mid-2024 lows, monthly inflation rising to 2 to 3% range, year-over-year inflation stabilizing at elevated levels despite continued fiscal discipline. This acceleration reflected diminishing contribution of the one-time shock, stabilization of the real exchange rate near the upper band, continued monetary expansion as the economy recovered. The math is undeniable. Inflation fell dramatically. But the sustainability? That's the $400 billion question. Now let me show you something that actually worked without caveats. The most celebrated deregulatory victory: elimination of Argentina's rent control regime. The rent control law imposed in 2020 during the Peronist government severely restricted landlords' pricing power. Minimum 3-year rental terms, indexation only annually despite volatile inflation, payment in pesos despite currency depreciation. These restrictions created economic distortions. Landlords, facing constraints on adjusting rents upward to compensate for inflation and currency risk, found rental housing increasingly unviable. Rather than accept below-market rents, landlords withdrew properties, converted them to owner-occupied use, rented through informal channels, listed on short-term tourist platforms where they could charge in dollars, or simply mothballed them as vacant. Between June 2020 and December 2023, rental housing supply in Buenos Aires fell 53%. The real price of rental housing actually increased dramatically as landlords jacked up starting rents for new leases to compensate for restrictions on subsequent adjustments. The law designed to make housing affordable made it scarce and expensive. When Milei repealed rent controls through his December 2023 mega decreto, landlords immediately responded. Rental listings on Zonaprop, a major real estate portal, 5,500 in December 2023, 15,300 by June 2024, a 180% increase, 1/3 occurring in just the first month. In the Buenos Aires metropolitan area, rental housing supply increased 212% between December 2023 and June 2024. The market moved from extreme shortage to relative abundance. Tenants could shop among options, negotiate terms, and here's the kicker. Despite the explosion in supply and elimination of price restrictions, real rents actually declined. Government data: real rents fell 27% in the first 7 months after deregulation when adjusted for inflation. Nominal rents increased 61% in peso terms in 2024, roughly half the inflation rate. For tenants like Aldana Oliver, who spent 18 months searching for an apartment under rent control before finding a studio for $200 per month after deregulation, the change was dramatic. This is what actual deregulation looks like when it works. Not theory, not ideology, math. Remove the artificial constraint, supply explodes, prices adjust to equilibrium, consumers win. Beyond rent control, the administration pursued deregulation across sectors, eliminated import licenses, lowered certain tariffs, liberalized satellite internet markets, bringing coverage to rural areas. The housing market improvement was most visible and unambiguous: increased supply, falling real prices, improved transparency. But, and this is crucial, the deregulation occurred against the backdrop of deep recession, extremely high real interest rates constraining investment, strengthened exchange rate reducing export competitiveness, public sector spending cuts reducing demand. These macroeconomic headwinds limited the ability of deregulation to generate robust private sector investment and employment growth. Deregulation worked in specific markets, but it couldn't overcome the macro constraints. You can't deregulate your way out of a recession when nobody has money to spend. While Milei's stabilization produced impressive macroeconomic results, the employment dimension revealed profound tensions. Unemployment rose from 6.4% in Q1 2024 to 7.9% by Q1 2025, the highest level in 4 years, approximately 250,000 additional jobless persons in a single year. But aggregate numbers obscure sector-specific devastation. Construction bore the most severe burden. Public works, suspension, and recession-driven collapse of private construction investment eliminated approximately 65,382 formal jobs, a 15.5% contraction between December 2023 and October 2024. Manufacturing lost approximately 25,000 jobs over the same period. Import competition intensified by the strengthened peso. Reductions in domestic demand from consumption collapse. The quality as well as quantity of employment deteriorated. Formal employment, registered positions in the social security system, providing legal protections, benefits, security, declined relative to informal employment outside the system. Q1 2025. Only 46% of employed persons held registered salaried employment, the lowest level since 2007. Informal employment and self-employment increased by approximately 224,000 positions between 2024 and 2025. Workers displaced from formal sector jobs finding survival through informal activities with lower incomes, fewer benefits, reduced security. Female unemployment, 9% compared with 7% for males. Nominal wages in both private and public sectors failed to keep pace with inflation despite dramatic disinflation by mid-2024. January to April 2025, private sector salaries rose 9.6%. Inflation totaled 11.6%. Real wage declines even in the recovery phase. The government deliberately restricted wage growth. Resisted union demands for collective bargaining increases beyond inflation. Refused to adjust public sector salaries above modest increments. This policy meant the benefits of reduced inflation rates weren't immediately apparent to wage earners. Monthly inflation reduction from 25% to 2% translated to continued real wage decline when wage growth was restricted below inflation. The cumulative impact, unemployment, reduced hours, real wage declines, compressed purchasing power, and aggregate demand precisely when stabilization required fiscal discipline and austerity. The measures necessary for stabilization, spending cuts, wage restraint, monetary tightening, were precisely those that reduced demand, maintained excess unemployment, prevented recovery. The administration maintained recovery would eventually occur once confidence was restored and inflation expectations fully anchored. Investment and employment would return. Critics questioned whether political tolerance for sustained austerity would permit this sequence to unfold. Think about the human cost. Construction workers who built the country's infrastructure, now unemployed because public works vanished overnight. Manufacturing employees watching their jobs disappear to import competition while the government celebrated the strong peso. This is economic surgery without anesthesia. The patient is still breathing, but the pain is excruciating. The social consequences extended beyond unemployment to dramatic changes in poverty and inequality. The poverty rate initially surged following Milei's inauguration, from 41.7% when he took office to a peak of 52.9% in the first half of 2024. More than half of all Argentines living below the poverty line, an increase of 11.2 percentage points, millions of additional people. The government characterized the poverty spike as necessary, clearing the air before recovery could commence. But by late 2024 and into 2025, poverty rates began declining from peaks. The poverty rate fell to 38.1% in the second half of 2024, down 14.8 percentage points from the first half peak. Extreme poverty, those living on less than half the poverty line, fell from 18.1% in H1 2024 to 8.2% in H2, a reduction of nearly 10 percentage points. Approximately 1.7 million children lifted out of extreme poverty according to UNICEF. These reductions reflected multiple factors: acceleration of economic recovery as GDP growth resumed, improved agricultural exports following drought's end, falling inflation reducing price shock impacts on fixed-income individuals. The government heralded these reductions as vindication. Critics countered that the initial surge to near 53%, even if temporary, represented genuine human suffering affecting millions. The reductions merely represented partial recovery from the depths, rather than return to pre-crisis conditions or new prosperity. Approximately 11 million Argentines still lived in poverty by late 2024, 2.5 million facing extreme poverty. But analysing poverty trends obscured substantial distributional consequences. Upper-income Argentines, holding dollar savings, access to international capital markets, owning inflation-hedged assets, experienced the devaluation and adjustment as an opportunity. Repatriate wealth at favourable exchange rates, acquire assets at distressed prices. Middle and lower-income Argentines, lacking dollar reserves, dependent on peso incomes, experienced the adjustment as compression of purchasing power, loss of employment, difficulty meeting basic needs. One analysis noted, a privileged minority is reliving the travel and shopping boom of the 1990s thanks to a strong peso and cheap dollar, while the middle and lower classes are increasingly cutting back on spending to make ends meet. These distributional patterns reflected deep structural features the Milei adjustment didn't address and arguably exacerbated. Argentina's reliance on commodity exports, soybeans, agricultural products, generated substantial export revenues, highly concentrated among large agricultural and agribusiness firms, benefits unevenly distributed. Fiscal adjustment cut most heavily into social spending benefiting lower-income groups. Subsidies for energy, food, transportation that had previously shielded the poor from full market prices. The rich got richer, the poor got poorer, the middle class got squeezed. Same story, different chapter, a persistent tension within Milei's program, exchange rate policy. The government's stated ideological commitment to currency liberalization and eventually full dollarization came into conflict with practical necessity of maintaining currency controls and managing the exchange rate. Milei had campaigned on a platform promising full dollarization, complete replacement of the peso with the US dollar as legal tender, arguing dollarization would permanently eliminate monetary policy discretion, prevent future governments from financing deficits through monetary expansion. Once elected, however, the president and his team concluded full dollarization was infeasible in the short term. Argentina's insufficient dollar reserves, lack of international support for unilateral dollarization, the reality that dollarization would deprive the government of seigniorage revenues and potentially constrain monetary policy needed for recovery. The administration adopted a transition strategy toward currency competition, a regime where the dollar would circulate alongside the peso with minimal restrictions. However, practical implementation proved far more complicated. Fully liberalizing currency choice would immediately generate massive capital flight of pesos into dollars, likely triggering the very inflation and devaluation dynamics it was attempting to prevent. Throughout 2024 and into 2025, the administration maintained substantial capital controls and foreign exchange restrictions, despite stated ideological opposition. Individuals allowed to purchase limited quantities of dollars at official rates, companies faced far tighter constraints. Maintaining a de facto dual currency system that had evolved informally through black markets. The blue dollar market continued representing true scarcity value of dollars, the spread between official rate and blue rate reflecting the premium for access outside formal controls. The supposedly market-determined ban system actually involved extensive central bank intervention to maintain the peso within the band. By late 2025, the peso settled near the upper band limit of 400, where it remained despite continued interventions. The ban represented not market equilibrium, but government price target maintained through ongoing intervention. These persistent currency controls and exchange rate management despite ideological opposition represented a fundamental constraint on the libertarian project. The government couldn't allow the exchange rate to move to levels market supply and demand would have determined without intervention. Such movement would have immediately reignited inflation through higher import costs and capital flight. This bind meant that while the administration achieved substantial deregulation in many sectors, currency markets remained subject to state control. The most fundamental aspiration of full dollarization remained unrealized despite repeatedly being stated as a medium-term goal. The chainsaw president couldn't cut the currency controls, because cutting them would have set the building on fire. The Milei administration's reform program occurred within a transformed geopolitical context. The government forged exceptionally close alignment with the Trump administration, obtaining unprecedented levels of IMF support, creating both opportunities and constraints. The government moved rapidly to realign foreign policy, away from the multipolar approach of prior Peronist administration, toward more explicitly Western and pro-US orientation. May 2024, US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen visited Buenos Aires. Demonstration of support. signal that Trump administration would prioritize Argentina as strategic ally in the region. Yellen declared Argentina a systemically important ally in Latin America, offered support for stabilization efforts. US Treasury subsequently facilitating IMF approval of $20 billion support program, second largest in IMF history. The IMF program, approved April 2024 with revisions in 2025, included immediate disbursement of $12 billion in financing. For Milei, the IMF support provided crucial financing to rebuild central bank reserves depleted during prior administration, maintain exchange rate during transition to new monetary regime. The alignment proved particularly consequential as external conditions deteriorated late 2024 and 2025, when currency market pressures intensified October 2024, threatening to force devaluation and undermine exchange rate band. US Treasury authorized $20 billion currency swap. Argentina's central bank could access dollars directly for foreign exchange intervention. This swap, essentially a loan of dollars repayable in pesos, provided critical lifeline, allowed government to continue defending the peso without immediately depleting limited reserve base, reflected strategic value Trump administration placed on maintaining friendly government in Argentina, preventing economic crisis that might destabilize region. But this geopolitical alignment and reliance on US support created both advantages and vulnerabilities. Advantages: direct access to Treasury support, influence over IMF program design, reduced risk of external pressure to reverse reforms. Vulnerabilities: dependence on single external patron whose priorities might shift. Risk of destabilization if Trump administration's commitment wavered. The arrangement drew domestic political criticism from progressive and nationalist constituencies who viewed close US alignment as compromising Argentine sovereignty. The IMF program itself created expectations and constraints. The fund required maintenance of fiscal surplus targets, limits on central bank credit expansion, gradual liberalization of currency controls as conditions for continued disbursement. But Argentina's historical pattern suggested IMF programs had frequently been modified or abandoned when political pressures intensified. The lifeline from Washington is real, but lifelines can be cut. So what's the verdict? Milei's chainsaw experiment produced undeniable macroeconomic wins. Fiscal deficit eliminated, inflation crushed from 2.11% to 43.5%. Central bank reserves rebuilt, the IMF applauding, markets rallying. But those numbers tell half the story. Poverty spiked to 52.9%, unemployment hit 4-year highs, real wages collapsed 25 to 35%, construction lost 15.5% of its workforce, universities, hospitals, public services gutted. The peso, despite all the libertarian rhetoric, still controlled by the state, because freeing it would trigger the very chaos they're trying to prevent. Here's the brutal reality. Argentina traded one crisis for another. They stopped the bleeding from hyperinflation, but the patient is still in critical condition. The question isn't whether the surgery was necessary. The question is whether the patient can survive the recovery. The dollarization promise? Broken. The currency controls? Still there. The geopolitical lifeline from Trump? Fragile. One administration change in Washington, one shift in priorities, and that $20 billion swap evaporates. And underneath it all, the structural problems remain. Commodity dependence, institutional weakness, a century of policy reversals that destroyed any credibility the government ever had. Milei's bet is that if he can hold the line long enough, confidence will return, investment will flow, employment will recover, the economy will heal itself once the state stops poisoning it. But history suggests otherwise. Every Argentine stabilization attempt for 50 years followed the same arc. Initial success, market euphoria, then reality, social pressure, political backlash, policy reversal, return to crisis. The difference this time, the ideology is more extreme, the cuts deeper, the resistance stronger. In March 2025, riot police tear-gassed protesters. A photographer took a canister to the head. Universities are on strike. Retirees are marching, construction workers have nowhere to go, and half the employed population is working informally with no benefits, no security, surviving day to day. This is the laboratory, the real-world test of whether you can austerity your way to prosperity, whether you can starve a fever without killing the patient. The macroeconomic scorecard says, maybe. The social scorecard says, not yet. The political scorecard says, we'll see. Because here's what everyone watching Argentina needs to understand. This isn't just about one country's experiment. This is the template, the model that libertarian economists have been waiting decades to test at scale. If Milei succeeds, if Argentina breaks the cycle, stabilizes, grows, this becomes the playbook for every country drowning in debt and inflation. Slash spending, freeze wages, let the currency appreciate, wait for confidence. If he fails, if the social pressure becomes unbearable, if the next election brings back the Peronists with promises of subsidies and spending, then the lesson is different. That there are limits to how much pain a democracy can absorb. That you can't fix institutional rot with a chainsaw. That some problems are too deep for shock therapy. Right now we're in the middle. The surgery is done, the patient is breathing, but the pain is excruciating, and the recovery has barely begun. Argentina's chainsaw experiment isn't over. It's just getting started. If this breakdown made your brain spin, if you want to understand the real